Family, welcome to the pro-black perspective on KWAZ Radio. Make sure you check out the other content on KWAZ Radio. Right now, we're going to do a book that was recommended to us called An Economic Strategy for the Second Liberation of Africa. Yes, we're doing it with A.M. Babu in the sense that A.M. Babu had written the book. Uh, let's get right into it. The reason why it's sideways is because the pages are sideways. We're going to try to jump right into it. This is the table of contents. As you can see, it straightens up. We're going to maybe zoom in a little, help us read this a little. 175 looks pretty good. And we're all good. Let me see something. Yeah. All right. Okay, so let's keep going. The real meaning of the African crisis. So this is the introduction. The real meaning of the African crisis is that our countries, collectively and individually, are at dead end, thanks entirely to the economic development policies pursued since independence. The situation is so bad that no reform, whether inspired by the World Bank or IMF, International Monetary Fund, or initiated locally, can get us out of this mess. For what is needed is not reform, but a different outlook which calls for a decisive change of direction, a change from the primitive colonial structure of the economy to a national economy. Above all, a change in the structure of production. This entails a change from an outward motivated to an inward motivated development strategy whose guiding principle must be based on the recognition that external causes are only a condition of change, whereas internal causes are the basis of change. All right? The African crisis is reflected in, among other phenomena, the total destruction of our national currencies. Thanks to IMF and the World Bank, in practically all African countries, there are no national currencies, only fluctuating tokens of the dollar or the French franc. All real business is conducted in terms of these two currencies. And the reason is that, except for the franc zone, whose currencies are tied into and backed by the French treasury, the destruction of the national currencies is at once the cause and effect of the disunity between the economy and the financial sector, which is supposed to service it. The disunity of these two most important sectors in the national economy has led to a killing field situation for speculative capital and foreign exchange dealers. And as long as this disunity remains, there can be no reform, because the two sectors remain in perpetual state of disharmony, of one negating the other. So this is already pretty interesting as an introduction. My question is, what year was this written? Oh, wow. Wait, no, I thought it was going to be 2010. It looks like 1994. 2010, actually. So this is 10 years ago. So it's actually pretty current, pretty recent. And let's see if, let's see how things are. All right. Anyway, so I'm going to say hey to the chat. Peace, chat. All right. My phone's blowing up, as usual. It is the US dollar which takes advantage of the resultant chronic disparity between the official and the so-called parallel exchange rates. Okay? All that the IMF and the World Bank do to correct this disparity is to call for better management of the monetary and financial sectors. It is the monetarist prescription for all kinds of economic ailments. But the result has always been disastrous to the well-being of the people, without doing much reform to the economies. This is true in Poland and no less in Ghana. It is true in Russia as in Zambia. No matter how developed or undeveloped a country may be, the prescription is the same and the result is the same: economic chaos and social instability. Is there a conspiracy here? Not necessarily. The disastrous consequences are only the natural response to the laws of economic development. If you are at an economic cul-de-sac and you try to save the situation by going for financial rather than economic solutions, then you are bound to fail. Listen to that. If you go for financial rather than economic solutions, then you are bound to fail. Money, after all, is only the outcome of the economy and not the other way around. A viable solution can only come out of the real economy: production, exchange, distribution, and consumption. The reason why Anglo-Saxon economies are in a mess is that since 1980 and the advent of Reaganomics, they have consistently ignored the basic economic rule. Their monetarist fanaticism led them to emphasize making money through speculation, while the more realistic Germany and Japan continue to make goods. You see, and this is something that we actually see in this whole Bitcoin thing too. Shout out to my brother, if he's listening. Uh, but yeah, a lot of us are trying to make money off of speculation. Out of, hey, is this going to rise? Okay, sell, rise, fall, as opposed to the basics, which is production, exchange, distribution, and consumption. You know, in essence, it's trade. That's what I say. Trade being exchange as well. But in essence, the economy goes down to trade. Uh, so anyway, and so are the monetary solutions of the IMF and World Bank. They are not for reactivating the basic sectors of our economy, but for pushing us deeper into the world market that continues to operate according to its predetermined orders of priority. And in that order, we are to remain producers of primary commodities, and our finances are to be adjusted accordingly to facilitate that function, no matter what harm this does to the rest of the economy. The second liberation of Africa, therefore, requires first of all that we ask ourselves, do we want to continue in that prescribed role? It is clear that Africa's leadership is reconciled to this status, while at the same time calling for a new international economic order. This position is also echoed by the UN Economic Commission for Africa by the Africa Development Bank, which, by the way, has now turned itself into a mini IMF and a spokesman for international financiers, and even by the OAU itself. But the elusive New World Order does not seem to be anywhere near the horizon, and the reason for this delay is simply this: the existing World Economic Order is the only possible one under the conditions of the free world market economy. To wish for something else is to indulge in metaphysics. This is very important. You have to realize that this World Economic Order is this free market economy is structured in this way. It's always going to be structured in this way because, again, Africa is rich in resources, and unfortunately, Wazungu and them, they're rich in technical sciences. They're rich in technical work, and the two go together. But they go together with you on the losing end. They'll go together with you on the losing end. So let's say, but if we want a second liberation in the real world, we must change our outlook, the direction of our economies, and the focus of our priorities. The starting point must be the satisfaction of the people's basic needs: food, housing, and clothing. We must abandon as a precondition the old notion of looking outwards for our survival and orientate the economies to look inward for solutions. External factors, trade, aid, foreign investment, and loans must only complement internal activities, but not the other way around. And I want to say this: I say there's four necessities. That's food, clothing, shelter, and consciousness. We shouldn't really neglect consciousness, but I understand if that's neglected. Actually, it's really a fundamental. You want your economy to be based around those four needs: your food, your clothing, your shelter, housing, and your consciousness. If you neglect consciousness, that's partly why everything else is neglected. And it's like, I actually heard somebody say something along the lines of, if you send your children to be taught by the enemy, they will come back thinking that you are an enemy. And that's something very, very important, that your children are going to look at you as an enemy if they are taught by the enemy, because that's what the enemy teaches. That's how the enemy teaches their children, and they're giving you the same lesson plan. You understand? In order to embark on this new path, we need to have general principles. In order to embark on this new path, we need to have general principles to guide us, but which at the same time could be modified to suit local conditions. In an unevenly, I don't know why I said that's weird. In an unevenly developed continent like Africa, each region and indeed each country has its own specific characteristics which have to be taken into account before any strategy is formulated. That is why the following will remain essential general principles to guide us in our analysis and in organizing for radical political and economic action in each specific case and region. As Africa is undergoing rapid democratic transformation away from the political culture of the one flirty states and military dictatorships to multi-partism, it must be useful for those of us from the radical tradition to have a clear view of what all this means and what our role and responsibility should be in providing political leadership. Again, your goal is to be the political leadership of Africa. Although the free marketers want to view the free market objective as part and parcel of the democratic transformation, we must keep in mind that the two, we'll turn off this ringer, The two are not necessarily linked. You can have one without the other. The fact still remains that there are two contending social systems, one represented by neoliberalism, in which the interests of the individual are paramount at any social cost, the other represented by social democracy, in which the interests of the society as a whole or the community are paramount. The radical tradition stems from the latter, and the reason for the radicals' pursuit of this social system with a bias to society is simply due to the realization that it is the natural condition of the human being. As the clumsiest among like species, we owe our survival as a distinct species to our social instinct. We always group together and invented mechanisms to defend ourselves as a group. For radicals, therefore, democracy must mean social democracy, which promotes and encourages positive aspects of individual initiative. So I'm going to start taking notes because this is actually a part that I would disagree with. Right? I'm not really, not that I'm not for democracy, but I also understand democracy as a foreign system, and I mean I can probably, we'll see if how this plays out, how this articulates. So I'm just going to take a quick note, and that's what you should do when you're reading. Just take quick notes, or even I think there's actually a way to make notes on this thing. Let's see. Is this right? I think this is it. Is it democracy? Yeah, I guess my computer calls me Sabo. Oh dang, I just deleted it. Okay, let me just. All right, don't worry about it. Let's see. All right, cool. We are always grouped together in, okay, so clumsiest, we are always grouped together. We may thus categorize this new era of democratic revival as the era of the new democracy for Africa, which must mean, if the current democratic absurdists to mean anything, a movement for seeking, in Nkrumah's memorable phrase, the kingdom of self-government, a movement towards upholding the principle of government by the people. At any rate, this seems to be the interpretation and expectation of the ordinary people of Africa since the days of the struggle for independence, although the born-again Democrats may have a different motive in misinterpreting democracy and confusing it with free market. For a government by the people to be realized and to ensure that it is by the people and for the people, Africa must have a policy and a radical program necessary to bring about a change and to empower the people in directing and giving meaning to their political, economic, and social aspirations and charting a new path that will take us out of the post-colonial rut and dilapidation. In order to do so, we must begin by at least recognizing what it is that we are rejecting and what we want to replace it with. Going by our hellish experience of the post-colonial past, we must say loudly and in one sentence, that we are rejecting excessive reliance on a political and economic strategy of outward orientation, and in its place, we need to firmly establish and adhere to a strategy of inward orientation in the political, economic, and social direction as outlined below. So this is where I would say there is a slight, I can't copy and paste, but this is where I would say there is that misinterpretation, that contradiction. So that's the thing that you'll notice when it comes to black literature, and that is that we have, or even black theory, is that you'll have these contradictions, and because of that, I want to highlight how this is a contradiction. Okay. So anyway, I did say what's up, chat. Come on. What's up? All right. So why is this a contradiction? And somebody, let's pretend somebody asked me that, right? So why is this a contradiction? So he says you want to reject excessive reliance on political and economic strategies of outward orientation, right? And you want to replace it with political, economic, and social direction of an inward orientation, okay? And then you got to ask yourself, is that democracy? I.e., isn't democracy malleable from outside? You see what I'm saying? The issue with not only is democracy itself an outside principle, but what democracy does is that it's the way how it works, is the way how it operates, is that the outside has great influence. The outside has great influence. So much so, in fact, that if you look at, for instance, the America and the Constitution, you have a House of Representatives and you have a Senate. And the reason why you have two legislative bodies, right, is because it was understood that the common house, the House of Representatives would be influenced by the outside, would be influenced by foreigners, because the masses, you would expect, are very influenced by media, and media itself would be like of diverse origins. I mean, with the exception of dictatorships, right? Uh, Anybody can speak within, like, anybody can influence another nation, and so especially in the context of U.S. imperialism, you can expect that tremendous influence. You can expect that influence, and the example being like radio. I think it's radio or Free America or Free Radio, something like that. Some nonsense radio program. So the chat can let me know when they want to let me know. All right. So let's go to the next page. So this is the political direction of new democracy. So I'm already not liking democracy. But I mean, maybe this brother's going to convince me otherwise. So we must pursue the policy of new democracy, which in essence means giving power to the people. That is to say, to establish the principle and practice of government by the people. We must accept the thesis that while it is absolutely essential for the radical left to recognize the importance and the role of class in society in its theoretical perspective, we must not, at this economically backward level of our development, follow the line of class reductionism. In this respect, we must accept the dialectical reality that there is struggle, but also that there is unity of opposites. That is to say, struggle is only one side of a contradiction, and unity is the other side. Each plays its appropriate role in the course of social development. Thus, in conditions of economic underdevelopment, the reality must be on unity rather than on struggle, without, of course, neglecting the primacy of class relations, especially for the study of the evolution of modes of production. New democracy, as government by the people, must be based on broad-based people and on institutions that will ensure the democratic representation and control as well as accountability. Speaking of which, I do want to say, this brother is what was it? Like, this brother does write pretty well. Let me greet the. So someone just joined my Discord, and so I just had to greet them. I forgot to say that. I forgot to tell these. Alright, never mind. Alright, so while multipartism is. Oh yeah, I just want to say that he's writing really clear, really on the level. He's not writing above us. He's not writing, he's writing on the level. This is a good writing style. I just want to point that out too. I didn't know the brother was writing this book so recently. I probably wouldn't have read it online, but but I mean, it's socialist literature, so he's probably cool with it. Dang, I just heard my. I might have to get up for a second. But alright, while multipartism is essential for parliamentary democracy and for ensuring democratic representation, its establishment as a system does not in itself ensure new democracy, nor does it ensure the creation and equitable distribution of national wealth. A society of mass poverty on the one hand and massive wealth in the hands of a few on the other cannot develop the necessary conditions for the creation of national wealth to its fullest potential, nor can it be democratic. To bring... Oh wait, let me actually... I forgot. Okay, peace, sis. I was gonna tell you that there's you can check out the channel for the free books. I'll give you a moment to do that while I gotta just get up for 2 seconds. Alright. Sorry about that, fam. Alright, let's go. Let's see. Let's go. Alright. So with multiple, so to bring about a new democracy, the parliamentary system must be supplemented with and strengthened by our other popular institutions and civic organizations, such as local government, trade unions, cooperative movements, independent women and youth organizations, assemblies, or organizations for environmental concerns of minority rights, and so on. These will help unify the people at all social and national levels. They will also help devise a sound economic strategy reflecting the people's interests. So, this is important too. You have to go about with building institutions in your community. That's one of the main things that we should be about right now. Even if the government is, and that's the trouble though. It's like if you want to be inside of a non-hostile government. Okay, you want to be in a non-hostile government, a friendly government, and in that friendly government, build institutions. This is a lot of reason why I would say that we have to repatriate, because if you don't repatriate, what you have is individuals who, basically, they can destroy your institutions at any moment. And actually, I want to tell you, yesterday was this conference. I'll tell you, the Centennial Conference was excellent. I kind of wish I could have uploaded my presentation, but I was unable to record it. Hopefully I can get that recording another day though. But in one of the presentations, this brother was talking about how he has like survival kind of group, like a group where people practice their martial arts and their firearms and all that, right? And within months of starting this program, he's hit up by the government, and the government is telling him, "Hey, we heard that you're doing unlicensed boxing matches in your backyard." And it's like, that's how serious the state is watching him, to the point of they can see that he's active in his own like neighborhood. This is really and truly what I mean about a hostile government. And I mean there's an example, also on the Discord. So like I say, everybody should join the Discord, of this thing called Mombasa Raha, right? But basically it's like sex education, and it was on it's on Kenyan TV. Or even a less adult example would be how Brother Kambon, right? Brother Kambon is on he's on Ghanaian TV, just talking free men. He's in the media apparatus, and there's institutions that will allow that kind of free speech and that free pro-black culture speech that you don't find in the West. You don't find it encouraged, you don't find it existing, or if it does, it's like on public TV that nobody's watching. But it's not mainstay. It's not news. It's not the biggest channels in the world. And that's something that is critical for us. And of course, that stuff gets shut down, like I said. To ensure the above is firmly established and sustained that the dominant political culture, with enough flexibility to allow for change when changes are needed to strengthen and further consolidate that culture, is ultimately the responsibility of the radicals. It is only they, with their commitment to social justice, who must bear the responsibility to remain the conscience of this society. Radicals must therefore play full part in the multi-party system of their country, must ensure the supremacy of their ideas and their aspirations. They should not be ashamed to be patriotic in defense of real national people's interests. To ensure leadership, they must have sound policies on all major national issues, and those policies must make sense to the people. They must, above all, project a credible vision of future which the people can recognize and with which they can identify. They must take into account what others in the political field are doing, but they must not be influenced by them. They must be influenced by their own perspective, their own world outlook, and remain faithful to their own vision of the future single-mindedly. These are the qualities that are needed for leadership on societies mired in poverty, but which have the will and determination to get out of by sheer effort and reliance on the diligent labor of their people. Their immediate political goal must be the establishment of the hegemony of the people. This objective can be realized only if the following are strictly adhered to: commitment to unify all the popular forces that are for radical change, and struggle against all forces that seek to divide them, or those who seek to sell the country to external bidders. So, and this is the problem that we're going to have when you're trying to establish something political in Africa. That is that you're going to have those who are trying to sell the country to external bidders. And the truth is this, that it's this concept right here, you know, and this is what I say about this democracy thing. This concept right here, sell the country to external bidders, is it's a very common idea in Africa. Okay, I want to tell you that that's going to be a very, very common idea in Africa. And why would I say that? You know, at one point, I was trying to learn, you know, Swahili from somebody, right? It was like a woman, in fact, right? And this woman said, "Come to." She was inviting me to Africa. Like, she just kept inviting me to Africa. She said I could stay with her or stay in her village or whatever. And, you know, people like her, blah, blah, blah. And then later on, though, check this out. Later on, she found out I was black. So, so here's the thing. She thought I were white. She thought I was white, right? And so she's inviting me hard to come to Africa and stay with her and blah 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 blah. You know, even though she's like a married woman, so she wasn't like, it wasn't like, you know, anything blah blah. But the idea was that a white American would have money, therefore she would want a white American to come in and just drop a bunch of money, and so on and so forth. So it's to say that this is like a commoner. She's not in government. She's not, you know, doing public policy. She's not anything of that sort. But she is saying, yes, I would like a cash infusion from the West. And as we talked about earlier from Babu, he's saying, look, a cash infusion from the West is the West's specialty. It's their specialty, but it does not grow economies. But it's also what our people want on the continent. They want Western visitors, and they want cash infusions, and that's like it's as if, you know, if you're trying to fight, like, you're fighting the masses. Again, this is why, you know, like, a true democracy would lead to that exact principle. We want cash infusions. We want cash infusions. That's why I wouldn't even mess with it. They must commit themselves to struggle against those who seek to obstruct the democratic process or seek to hamper people's economic aspirations or undermine their well-being through exploitation for individual interests of the more powerful and more privileged. So this is why I said it's another contradiction, and that's why I want to write that down. I want to write it down. You know, the people's economic aspirations, right? And it's like with regard to the you know, recent music video discussion. You know, what are the people's economic aspirations? The people's economic aspirations are consistent with cash infusions, you know, not economic building, not economy building. All right, hold on a second. I just heard another emergency, so I'm gonna what's his face. Peace, brother. So, Bitter Medicine Podcast is here. You already know that's a good like a good thing to listen to, you know. Hold on. So, sorry about that. Apparently I gotta, you know, wipe this kid. Alright, can you guys hear me, by the way? I can't even tell if I'm. Let me make sure that I can be heard. All right, so more powerful and more privileged. Radicals must lead the movement to conserve what is positive in the national heritage and counter what is negative. They must commit themselves to direct national assets and national resources to serve the people and the development of the national economy. The political aims of the radicals must, of course, be to achieve state power, singly or in alliance with other political forces, in order to consolidate the new democracy and prepare the ground for economic revival and reconstruction and the promotion of social well-being of the people. Political organization for new democracy. In order to reach state power, the radicals, of course, must organize themselves in a political party that will lead the people to victory. The party must be guided by its constitution, its rules, and codes of discipline. It must have a program covering the political, economic, and social policies it proposes to pursue when in power. The party must train its cadre for day-to-day political work among the people, take up issues that affect them directly, and look for ways to resolve them, learn from the people, and to promote people's own leadership at all levels of the party. The party of radicals must not be simply a vehicle to state power, but it must be a means for establishing the political culture of new democracy at all levels of society, irrespective of political affiliations, of people, and of community. And this is important too. So a part of the problems I was outlining before about how the people right now have poor economic aspirations. That is partly what a political party is supposed to do. The political party is supposed to influence the people towards a political consciousness that would be for economy building as opposed to financial lending. Now, of course, the only question is this, though. While your political party exists, there's going to be another political party, and if that other political party is getting that cash infusion, right, you're already in trouble. You're already in trouble. It's like for instance, in America, you would have the Green Party and the Democratic Party. The Green Party may have these nice ideas, but the reality is the Democratic Party has money. You know what I'm saying? It has the Wall Street bank backing. And so with the Wall Street backing, it's able to be on television all the time. It's able to have these YouTube ads all the time. It's able to like with the amount of money you have, you can go on television, you can go on YouTube, you can have the media apparatus, you can have debates, you can have this, that, so on and so forth. You could make the election. You can make the ballot. You can make the ballot, design it in such a way that people mostly see your party first, and then the next party, and then the other parties are like in the corner. You can do all of this stuff because you have money. So that's another reason why this whole this notion is a little bit out of sync, particularly because how much influence can you have as a political party or as a small political party if political parties are allowed. And so that's actually another note I think I would raise. Like, how much money can a non-financed political party have in the absence? Like compared against financed political parties. So that's another question I can ask the TL. And look, you guys could actually answer this. Oh, peace, Tabo. Good to see you here. I know it's I guess early where you are, right? All right, so let's go. In taking over state power, the radicals must establish their administration, which is distinct from the political organization of the party. The administration must serve. Did I read this one? Oh yeah. The administration must serve the entire people within the state, without regard to their political affiliation or class position. The aim of the administration must be to mobilize all the people in the national effort for reconstruction. The people, the entire people, must always remain the object and subject of national development. And so this is really interesting because it reminds you of BLF or EFF and also, of course, ANC. ANC, so this is South Africa we're talking about. ANC is just running the show, okay? It has the backing of the international financiers. Right? EFF is the big challenger, right? But they don't win the election because, again, ANC has the financial backing. And then the BLF, who might be the most radical of them, just has like, is barely even on the ballot. You know what I mean? Barely even making the cut. And so even the EFF is over them. And so of course the BLF might challenge, hey, EFF, it looks like you're getting some international financing. It looks like you're getting white financing. And it's like, yeah, if you're in this battle if you're in this political party situation, you do need financing, because the system is biased. Democracies are biased towards the financier. So it's a contradiction. Isn't democracy biased to the political parties that are financed, a la ANC, EFF, the success of ANC versus EFF versus BLF. You know? As to say that, yeah, you could give people that political consciousness, but, you know, the political consciousness notwithstanding, you know, it's gonna screw up. It's gonna screw up if you're allowing for outside finances. So the economic and social direction of new democracy. Before they can chart a future economic direction, the radicals must first make it clear what has so far blocked the way of Africa's prosperity since independence. This can be summed up as follows. So it's going to be A, dependence on the developed world for Africa's own development. That's one. B, excessive use of socially necessary labor time in the production of useless goods for export. Instead of useful goods for our own human and developed needs. See below for further elaboration. Yeah, so we keep exporting useless things for us. Unequal trade terms about which position of economic weakness arises from the export of primary commodities only. We can do nothing except shout. D, unproductive use of foreign debts incurred and the corruption that goes with it, and debt service obligations at extremely unjustified high costs. E, poor energy policies that make us heavily dependent on external sources of energy and the depletion of our meager foreign exchange earnings in paying for the rising cost of oil imports. F, an irrational world economic order as a whole, which, again, cannot be changed from a position of economic weakness, however much we may shout. And then G, a radical economic strategy must take into account all the above points in the course of outlining its corrective policies and laying the foundation for economic and social development. Let us begin with the general guidelines. Okay? So this is general guidelines for creating conditions and developing an economic strategy necessary for the second liberation of Africa. Unifying financial and economic work and stabilizing prices. So the key problem in most of the mangled African economies, as noted above, is the division between the financial and economic sectors. So on taking over state power, the new democratic government must strive as a precondition to bring about the unity of these twin vital sectors. This is primarily a struggle against speculative capital, whose strategy and tactics can be worked out in accordance with a given concrete situation. In principle, though, we can generalize by observing that the breakup of economies in Africa has led to the emergence of large numbers of profiteers and speculators as a result of prolonged inflation and currency irregularities. Most of the private funds are therefore used for direct and indirect speculation. A large percentage of private capital is illegally used for what amounts to usury and black marketeering, which led to skyrocketing prices. The money market becomes tight and interest rates soar. As a result, the entire market is dominated by speculators with a flourishing illegal trade in foreign currencies and precious stones. They're just using their money to speculate and trade and legally trade in foreign currencies. As a rule, soaring prices stem from the imbalance between the amount of currency and commodities in circulation. So this is a rule. Prices stem from the imbalance between the amount of currency and commodities in circulation. Under these circumstances, speculative activities cannot be effectively checked by mere administrative means. Restoration of the balance between currency and commodities in circulation depends on a country's approach to economic development. For the neoliberal and the monetarists who seek all economic solutions from the point of view of money in circulation, their way of restoring balance is via monetary and fiscal policies, no matter what damage this does to the well-being of the population. unemployment, lower incomes for the masses, deteriorating standards of living for the majority, bankruptcies for small business, etc. It is the way of the IMF and World Bank. Again, this is the thing that I want to emphasize. We like to, say the IMF and the World Bank are bad, and yes, of course they're bad, but this is the way. This is their way. This is their MO. This is what they do. It's not necessarily. It's not necessarily going to be vindictive. It's not necessarily going to be. And here's the thing too. One thing you have to understand. A lot of it, in part, has to deal with, like I guess the white man's misunderstanding. The black man's misunderstanding of the white world. Okay, the white world, the way the white world operates is that they offer you a deal. Like basically, we know this is actually kind of weird too, to be honest. We know you barter. Like, we know how to barter with each other. We don't know how to barter with white people. And this is something that we all know. We know how to barter with each other. We actually brag about how we barter with each other. How if there is something on sale from a white man, from a black man, we say, hey, I would like to get this cheaper. Hey, I would like to get it. In fact, actually, I was just ordering some Haitian food just earlier today. And the sister said the food was $3 or whatever. And I paid the $3, but I said, hey, look, make sure you fill that plate. You know what I mean? Make sure you fill that plate. And she filled the plate. So it's like I got a little more, Whereas, and I mean, I'm not going to front. I go to a white restaurant and I say the same thing and they do it. But I'm just a greedy person, right? But why I say this is that you go to like somewhere like CVS, you go to somewhere like, or whatever white store you might go to, and you just pay the price they list. And it's the same with government contracts when it comes to white folk. White people say, hey, I would like to use your natural resources. I'd like to get these supplies from you. I'd like to do whatever. And we say, okay, that's the price now? Gotcha. Oh, you're buying bananas for this much? Okay, gotcha. And of course, if you're a small economy, you can't really say much or whatever, or you may feel that way. But the thing is this, that in Asia, you go and you try the same crap, and they're like, no. Here's what we want. And there's a sister who, you should listen to her. I don't remember her name off the top of my head. I think I linked it in the Discord. But there's a sister who tells us, hey, look, like she tells us that, yeah, when you go to black people and they write us something, they're happy. Like the white people are just happy. When the banks offer loans to black folk, they are happy because black folk take the first loan, even if it's terrible. Whereas then you go to white folk, and when you go to Asian folk, when they go to Asian folk, they're like, oh, this is going to be tough because, and a lot of times the Asians walk away with the better deal. So a lot of it, goes back to the first paper I wrote, which was we lose at the negotiation table. We can win in the struggle, but we lose in the negotiation table. And it's the same with regards to that. The IMF is supposed to give you money so that it benefits, and you're supposed to, if you're going to take money from the IMF, you're supposed to take money so that you benefit. And we don't even know how to do that. We kind of just yes boss, no boss, and that's one of the shames of our community. It's one of the stains of our intellectual community. So, but for an economy which is concerned more about the welfare of the people, the way to restore the balance is by increasing commodities in circulation, as we shall see below. African countries that have followed the IMF route, such as Ghana and others, which are claimed to be success stories, may show impressive economic growth figures as the cost of the fall of the living standard of the people. The current plight of Russia and other Eastern European countries shows that the IMF cure is worse than the disease. So Ghana, we already know, is a success story as far as we're concerned, and we sometimes do brag about the economic growth of Ghana, and yet here it is. China, on the other hand, in the wake of economic reforms, has chosen a way out by raising production quite impressively. This is the direct method of restoring the balance. For this kind of solution, i.e., the non-administrative or direct method of frontal onslaught, useful lessons can be learned from the experiences of post-war West Germany, when Dr. Erhard, then financial minister, had to deal with runaway inflation and speculative capital. Lessons can also be learned from the Chinese experience of the same kind after the revolution in 1949. Both these countries, with diametrically opposite social and economic systems, utilized the same direct method to achieve price stabilization. So increased product. I like that, but I'm gonna keep that just as increased what's this thing called? Increased. What did he say? Oh, yeah, commodities, I think. Yeah, increased commodities. Anyway, make sure you guys drop some likes and all that. Drop some likes. All right. It's not too many people, but I've learned, or I've heard, like I said, I was in the UAM, and they were saying, look, even if only one person showed up to the UAM, a meeting where they had to pay rent for the building, it's like you got to be appreciative of everybody. You got to be appreciative of even because people taking time out of their day. And that's the most important. So always appreciation for the people who show up. And the people who watch it later. Why not? So expanding the economy. The second step is to move as rapidly as possible from the primitive mode of production inherited from colonialism and enter the realm of expanded reproduction. See below for further elaboration of the need to move from simple reproduction to reproduction on an extended scale. This is the most critical and decisive threshold, essential for moving from a dependent to an independent national economy. Economic expansion needs A. Rapid development of the productive forces directed at producing basic needs. B. An industrialization that is fully integrated with agriculture. And C. A balance or proportionate relation between heavy industry, capital goods producing industries or machines that build machines, and light industry for consumer durables as well as wage goods. In other words, agriculture must serve industry and industry must serve agriculture. It is essential, however, to recognize that modernization of agriculture requires changes in the social organization of agricultural production and equitable distribution of land. Learning, so 4.3 is learning from historical experiences in economic development. What lessons can we learn from the developed industrial world, which now dominates the world economically, diplomatically, and militarily? Let us look at each region's experience. So there's the European and North American experience. Europe and North America have developed on the basis of industrialization. They achieved this thanks mostly to specific historical circumstances that obtained at the time. These included excessively cheap, almost free labor, slavery, and colonialism. This led to rapid capital accumulation, an already captured market abroad, and an unprecedented population expansion at home. In spite of this brutal history of slave labor, which accelerated capital accumulation, the American experience has some useful lessons in the logic of its economic foundation, which has eventually turned it into the strongest economy of the world. And this is important too. And I think that's why I have to look at this again. It's like in spite of the brutal history, because the reality is this: that it's not just slave labor. Yes, slave labor will give you excess capital, right? But you have to remember that, for instance, a country like Brazil had more enslaved Africans, and there's other examples of that, right? Other examples, Cuba, blah, blah, Venezuela, blah, 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 right? A lot of these countries had these enslaved Africans, but they did not become as wealthy. So you have to understand that this transformation of capital into wealth, there is a formula there that is not just owing to that excess capital. And that right there is actually, it's a really complicated notion that we have to think. And maybe he's going to articulate on it. So the American economy was founded on the production of food grains and cotton. In promoting food grain production, it made the country self-sufficient in food, which is the most important basic need. So you want to, we just want to look into that, yeah. So it is the first basic need. Cotton production on a massive scale, first for export to Britain, later for internal consumption, helped America not only to develop and extend its textile industry, but it also helped to revolutionize that industry by the invention of the gin, which transformed the manual separation of seeds from cotton into a mechanical operation and raised productivity several fold. What is more, it made cotton products affordable to the poor people worldwide. In Kenya, the Kiswahili word for the unprinted gray cloth is Marekani, American. The most important point in the U.S. national economy, however, was the textile industry provided a key link between heavy industry and agriculture. The result was agriculture formed the base. Textile and other light industries, for example, housing, construction, household appliances, and consumer durables, evolved around agriculture by supplying its needs and consuming its products. Heavy industry eventually developed to supply the machines needed to build light industries, and the latter in turn became the market for the heavy industry, as well as the suppliers of consumer goods for the workers in heavy industry. A symbiotic link thus evolved between heavy industry, light industry, and agriculture, which made the U.S. economy well integrated internally with an ever-expanding home market, which provided the stimulus and motive force of the national economy. However, in spite of these advantages, the U.S. economy is still undermined by weakness inherited in the capitalist mode of production, with its periodic and very damaging crises. And I think it's also important to know this too. So in the articles I was reading recently, it was pointed out that America was a debtor nation and became a creditor nation after World War One. I think it was World War One or World War Two. But that's really important. The fact that they were a debtor nation. So it's not to say that debt is all that bad, but what happens is that they took opportunity. They took opportunity of the collapse of Europe to become a creditor nation. And this is where it's actually pretty important to realize that not only was the U.S. like getting like finance from other countries and all that stuff, but and it's still being now right now it's a debtor nation, right? but it goes to show just to what extent and how how you have to take opportunities. You have to take advantage of the situation that's at hand. Otherwise, you're going to be messed up, right? So, oh, by the way, you guys know that the link for the book is in you all know that the link for the book is in the description. So if you want the book, the link to the book, if you want to follow along. All right, so let's go. If the U.S. economy developed on the basis of internal settler colonialism and slavery, European economies developed largely on the basis of external colonization and from income that came from the surplus labor of slaves. It cannot provide a model for developing third world countries because, being so dependent on foreign trade, they are extremely vulnerable to external shocks. Only the weaknesses of third world countries are suppliers. Only the weaknesses of the third world countries as suppliers of cheap raw materials and consumers of imported industrial goods from Europe keep Europe's economies more or less flourishing. So this is the thing that you have to understand too, that white wealth is dependent on black labor or black resources particularly. If we cut off, and this is why they wage war against us, because they understand, look, and this is why they topple governments before it starts, because they understand that if it's actually like this. I want to say it this way because I had this conversation, on actually on WhatsApp with my good brother, Gas. But actually it was somebody else in the chat. But I'm not really. I don't want to name drop because I want to feel like a snitch, But this was actually a pretty interesting point. So the idea was regarding whether the Biafra was in fact consistent with Nkrumah, right? And actually, here's what it is. I think I've said it pretty on the nose. So I wanna just scroll through my WhatsApp to see where it is. Let's see. I want to do that. Whoop! There it is. Dang, WhatsApp is pretty active. Let's see. I bypassed it. Let's see. I'll tell you. Sometimes you just. Okay, yeah. So it's like this. Entirely different. Like a breakaway state. So a breakaway state, if it detaches from the global economy, is brilliant. But if a breakaway state, if a breakaway state keeps attached to the global economy, it isn't, and that's the distinction that needs to be made. So whether Biafra or South Sudan or wherever, what's the other example this person gave? Oh yeah, Katanga. They were saying Katanga. So if these nations break away from the global economy and then create a federation among themselves, that is exactly what that's exactly what would combat Western domination. You have to get out of the like this is the trouble with the states in Africa at the moment, is that they are integrated into the global economy. You know, and the goal would be to get out of the global economy. But the thing is this, that the West understands that if you're out of the global economy, that they are reliant on the global economy. The global relationship of being supplied with cheap raw materials and also sending you industrial goods. Do you understand? If you get out of that relationship, then they get into the problem that capitalism has, which is overproducing industrial goods, and overexerting its own, or overusing their own raw materials. You understand? Or even not having any raw materials for themselves. So they will use their military might to stop you if you're not militarily strong. So you want to organize on a national level and also have that military strength. But let's see, this is the Japanese experience. So the Japanese are really interesting. The Japanese bourgeoisie also developed their national economy. At about the same time as their Euro-American counterparts. They too helped themselves to some colonial exploitation after the Meiji Restoration in 1868. In 1889, Japan emerged as a modern state with ambitions to be an industrial power. After the war with China in 1895, she colonized parts of China. In 1905, she won the war against Russia, and in 1910, she annexed Korea. In 1915, she presented China with the notorious 21 demands, which sought, among other things, to control China's mineral resources, especially coal deposits in North China. Japan's primitive accumulation of capital was enormously helped by conquest and exploitation of foreign labor and resources. Her development strategy followed the same path as that of Europe, and although she is now a manufacturing superpower thanks to the post-war special relationship with the U.S., which injected massive capital and technology into her economy and opened the U.S. market to her goods, Japan is nevertheless extremely vulnerable to external shocks. Okay? Japan cannot be a model for third world development. Although the newly industrializing countries, the NICs of Southeast Asia, are flourishing on the Japanese model thanks to massive Japanese capital and technology, they too cannot be a model for us because the circumstances and the conditions that gave them the kickstart, the Cold War, Korean War, Vietnam War, the U.S.-Japanese market, and technology no longer exists for the majority of countries, especially in Africa. Right? So there's the Soviet experience. So before the 1917 Soviet Revolution, Russia as a colonial power with vast resources was beginning to emerge as a capitalist industrial economy, enjoying large investments and loans from the West. After the revolution, foreign loans and investments dried up, and the new leaders of the Soviet Union were faced with the problem of finding sources for the primitive accumulation of capital. After serious disagreements among policymakers, Stalin's faction got the upper hand and adopted a policy of transferring massive surplus from the agricultural sector, from the peasantry, in order to invest in the industrialization program, mostly heavy industry. Stalin was then Secretary General of the Communist Party. They called this policy the law of primitive socialist accumulation. In the socialist theory of accumulation, there is only socialist accumulation. Only under capitalism do you have capital accumulation, primitive or otherwise. Okay, this is interesting. So, serious social economists, led by Bukharin, opposed this proposition. They argue that impoverishing the peasantry would hamper the development of the home market, distort the balance between agriculture and industry, stifle growth of light industry, which by its nature yields more profits owing to its quick turnover and a very short gestation period, and this trend would inevitably lead the economy to a lopsided development. But Stalin argued for heavy industry as a primary objective to enable the Soviet Union to develop a strong armament industry to defend herself, surrounded as she was by hostile capitalist countries of Western Europe and the U.S. Bukharin and his friends ended up in front of firing squad as enemies of the people. So I want to say this. So this is Stalin, USSR. I mean, I read it; it's pretty clear. But Bukharin, I mean, that's a name that should be familiar to some socialists. I've seen it. I don't really study the guy because again, Stalin won. But you see the problem. The problem is this: you get control of the state. Now you need to have capital to build industry. So he's saying, look, we're going to get the capital from the peasants, from the agricultural workers. And Bukharin says, no, we shouldn't even focus on that. We should focus on developing our economy. Stalin says, no, we got to build up our military. Bukharin said, that's a dumb idea, and then Stalin had him shot to death. Not too dumb an idea. Alright. As predicted, the Soviet policy turned into an economic disaster. Just as Bukharin foresaw, it led to a permanent imbalance between agriculture and industry, mass poverty in the rural areas, and 70 years later, the mighty Soviet Union was reduced from a superpower to a humble follower of the U.S. Stalin was right in one important aspect. As he had predicted, his political decision to favor heavy industry as a top priority helped the Soviet Union survive World War II. Exactly. Moreover, the Soviet Union was instrumental in the defeat of the powerfully and highly technical army of fascist Germany. 20 million Soviet people died and saved humanity from the brutalities of fascism. The imbalance in the Soviet economy led to a situation in which she was a superpower in military and space technology, with a third world economy characterized by mass poverty of the peasantry. And so the thing that I would say is that the Soviet Union should have adjusted. Stalin should have adjusted the economy back into Hotep and data. So I want to say that Stalin should have organized the economy back into the hands of like organize the economy to favor the peasantry once more after what he did, but I guess he didn't. And that's the thing that you have to realize when it comes to true statesmanship, through true economy building, and that's the idea that you can be flexible. You can be flexible. You need people in charge, people in power to be flexible. Now, of course, the only issue is that the heavy industry had to be kept being emphasized because the U.S. was doing the Cold War, and what the Cold War meant was that both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were having an arms race. So you could not slip. You could not slip. And so eventually this arms race led to the impoverishment of both countries, but the U.S. survived. Well, I mean, survived probably as a debtor to other countries, but the Soviet Union probably couldn't go into debt with other countries. So it's a really peculiar circumstance, but it is what it is. The Soviet experience was unique in that it was the first socialist country in history to challenge the imperialist powers when the Soviet Union was itself still economically and technologically extremely backwards. The dilemma of either choosing economic or political priorities that faced the Soviet leadership at the time was exceptionally critical, and it may not be fair to judge them purely on economic grounds. Exactly. However, those circumstances are not likely to face any African country. It is important for us to learn from the economic misjudgments that were made so we do not repeat them. And again, what are you talking about? You don't have an economy that can challenge the West. At the end of the day, that's what the Soviets had, and you don't. And of course, China is going to be one of those countries that does have an economy to challenge the West. And even 1.4 billion people. Come on, that's more. They have more Chinese people, and China's just a country. More Chinese people than there are African people. After the 1949 revolution and up to 1956, China followed the Soviet model, but very soon they saw in the model the inherent tendency towards imbalance between the major sectors of the economy, and therefore decided to abandon it. In rejecting the Soviet model, Mao put forward his famous 10 major relationships thesis, which were essential for developing a balanced economy. The most important of these relationships was that between heavy industry on the one hand and light industry and agriculture on the other. Mao stressed that the Soviets' lopsided stress on heavy industry to the neglect of agriculture and light industry results in a shortage of goods on the market and an unstable currency. This prediction was not due to an inspired prophetic vision, but rather due to the full grasp of the law of economic development. In any case, 35 years after the observation, events had proved the Maoist thesis to be realistic and correct, confirmed by the tragic collapse of the Soviet model in Europe. China, in the meantime, was making great strides, and by mid-1992, it had become the fastest-growing economy in the world, with an annual growth rate of 12% and a trade surplus with the U.S. alone of some $20 billion, which was second only to Japan's. What can we learn from the Chinese miracle? The one thing that is most outstanding is that while the U.S. has achieved this balanced development, as noted above, by unique historical circumstances, slave labor, settler colonization, with massive inflow of capital and skilled manpower from Europe, etc., in a haphazard and unplanned manner, China is achieving her balanced development through A. efficient development of the nation's socially necessary labor time, and B. through a sensible and realistic planning mechanism of observing the cardinal principles of proportionate and balanced development of the national economy. as the only fastest developing ex-semi-colonial country without external conquest or colonization. China is probably the perfect model for Africa's countries, big or small, to emulate. So yeah, China's an interesting country. Alright, so 5. Identifying ideal conditions for industrialization and development. A combination of several factors, as noted above, including Anglo-Saxon settler economies in America, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, created ideal conditions for advanced agriculture, industrialization, and development, which followed more or less the same pattern. A. Agriculture expanded in order to feed the growing domestic populations. But the agriculture was not based on the production of coffee or tea or cocoa, the standard third world crops, but largely on food grains, cotton, oilseeds, and other industrial crops as raw material for domestic industry. Remember, these coffee, tea, cocoa, those are export crops. Cotton, oilseeds, and other those are domestic industry. You see, domestic industry agriculture, right? So influx of labor from the rural to the urban, and this is why I said you gotta do statesmanship. You want statescraft. You want legislators to say, hey, you know what? We're going to subsidize those who produce cotton. We're going to subsidize those who produce oilseeds, and we're not going to, and we're going to tax people who produce coffee, tea, or cocoa. You know, like this is how you organize. This is how political power. This is how political power can influence economies. I think I heard something. Hold on. Sometimes you hear some noises and you're just like, let me go handle that, you know? Okay, so influx of labor from the rural to the urban industrial areas resulted in labor scarcity in agriculture and created conditions for innovation in capital-intensive farming, labor-saving techniques, and increased productivity. The growing demand for labor-saving techniques in agriculture induced industries to go for the production of producer goods and created conditions for capital goods production. Indeed, population growth created demand not only for more food, but also for more clothing and housing, which promoted textile industrialization and housing and construction industry, which constituted the foundation of national economies by creating massive employment opportunities and raising living standards. Expanding industrial capacity needed wider markets beyond the home market for the finished products. Expanded industrial activity in turn demanded more raw materials from abroad. The ensuring competition among the industrializing countries for external markets and for sources of raw materials stepped up colonization and centralization abroad. Further, technological expansion and naval superiority, which facilitated further colonization. All this gave Europe, America, and Japan the power to dominate the world economy, which they exploit to this day. So, what can Africa learn from the various experiences above? A. America and Japan had exceptional historical circumstances which no longer exist for the developing third world. So stop looking at America and Japan as examples. B. There is no going back to the birth throes of capitalism, slavery, and colonialism, which helped Europe and America to develop, although not for want of trying in Africa by the IMF and the international banker it serves. People are everywhere resisting any attempt to reintroduce the humiliating conditions of subjugation familiar under slavery and colonialism. In other words, primitive accumulation of capital, in our case, cannot take place in the same fashion as was the case in Europe, America, and Japan, through slavery or through the savagery inflicted on Native Americans and through colonialism. And this is the thing that you have to understand, that right now we have our people, they're trying it. They're trying to go back to this primitive accumulation, the slavery, the savagery, but it's not going to work. It's disgusting, and it's not like it's forcing something that shouldn't. Like, you just have to find a different way. But that the fact still remains that we must have the wherewithal for our own primitive accumulation of capital if we are to develop the productive forces and move on to the expanded reproduction, without which there can be no development. If in Europe and America the massive expansion of urban centers was indicative of economic growth, and created the necessary conditions for industrialization. In Africa, the expansion of urban population, on the contrary, is only indicative of the condition of rural stagnation and underdevelopment, which in itself obstructs national development. The mass poverty in towns and cities that we are now experiencing in Africa, cannot provide a stimulus to modern agricultural farming as it did in Europe and in other developed countries, nor can it be a source for accumulation as in the above cases. On the contrary, it has the effect of obstructing development and of worsening rural impoverishment, for the simple reason that our economies hardly respond to internal conditions. We only respond to external shock. Okay? So that's interesting. Like, our economies are pretty much, dependent on the foreigners themselves. Not really saying, hey, there needs to be food. Because, again, the problem is that Africa has, like, terrible politicians. And because they has terrible politicians, politicians who are not really focused on the economic development of the world, the country, it's not going to develop in the same way. It's not the same as in Europe, where you have, we have food scarcity. Oh no, we need to get some food. What happens is, if we have food scarcity, we say, hey, can you guys send us some food? Instead of, hey, let's plot some more land for food, it's like, hey, can you guys send us some food? So it's an actual, like, I'm liking this book. I don't know how you guys are liking it. Let me ask how you guys are liking this book. You guys liking this book? Are you all liking this book? Okay, let's go. So what can an African country do in order to develop a self-sustaining, independent national economy? So can Africa emulate the past? We cannot, of course, recreate the above favorable historical circumstances that helped advanced countries to develop, nor will the latter help us to develop and to become their competitors. Ever since the beginning of the 1980s, Europe and America have been doing everything to destabilize our economies through the IMF and the World Bank. The Bretton Woods system itself, since its inception in 1945, has been the main source of Western prosperity by ensuring a steady flow of wealth from poor countries to the rich. The net outflow, which includes the effects of debt servicing, brain drain, resource transfer, estimated in the mid-1990s at around $200 billion a year, or about $23 million per hour. Okay? That's the brain drain. Like, everything is the wealth of Africa is escaping her at $23 million an hour. Okay? $23 million an hour. Let me just write that down. $23 million an hour is the wealth escaping Africa. Or, although I don't know if that's a real, or $200 billion a year. Yeah, that sounds like it's $200 billion a year. That's actually kind of, I don't know if that's the math, but actually it might be the math. I don't know. I don't know how many hours are in a year, but I feel like it's a lot more than this person's math is working out, but I don't know. We have therefore no alternative. Oh, actually no, this 24 hours. Yeah, okay, it might be. Yeah, it works out. We have therefore no alternative but to find our way of starting the capital accumulation process, which includes putting a stop to the massive outflow of wealth. For Africa alone, the net outflow of value from the continent to the Western world was estimated then, in mid-1990s, at $200 million per day. Okay? $200 million per day is the net outflow. The outflow from Africa in terms of wealth, mid-1990s. And it just got worse. It only got worse. This amount, if retained in the continent, can be an important starting point for our primitive accumulation of capital. Which means that first we must be realistic and discard any illusion that anyone else except ourselves can help us develop. First. Secondly, if we cannot recreate historical circumstances, it is within our means to at least create artificial conditions which can and will induce development. If the West achieves its primitive accumulation of capital at the expense of Africa and other colonies, and the Soviet Union achieves hers at the expense of her peasantry and her Asiatic colonies, who will Africa exploit for primitive accumulation of capital? So it looks like, he's looking for somebody to exploit. Our experience since independence has shown that we cannot hope to start our accumulation via the export of primary commodities to the market. The world market, on the contrary, has been and is the main contributing factor to our poverty and our development because A, we waste almost all our socially necessary labor time in the production of useless agricultural commodities, primarily for export, yet we earn hardly anything to set our accumulation in motion. B, we put more into the world market than we get out of it, which means a net loss. Let it be said once again that any waste of the socially necessary labor time has its penalty, and in our case we pay the penalty by being condemned to absolute poverty and mass starvation. Alright? So a strategy for initial capital accumulation. So A, if we seriously want to set in motion the process of accumulation for productive investment, it is essential to first of all adopt a different world outlook in our approach to development. In other words, we must start with a different frame of mind. This outlook must be based on accepting the fact that external causes are only a condition of change, while internal causes are the basis of change. B, we must learn to utilize our socially necessary labor time more efficiently, concentrating more on the production of what we actually need for our own development rather than on what we hope to gain from exports. Gains from export can begin to be economically worthwhile only when the economy is soundly based internally and the needs of the people are regularly met. C, to start the accumulation process, we must rely entirely on the diligent labor and skills of our own people, now wholly exploited by external forces, and our own resources and on expanding internal market. To achieve this, we must have our people's own leadership at the helm instead of the wasteful and corrupt nuns we have so far experienced. So I want to actually just inject myself a little bit into this one right here. I want you, as on Cobia, let's say, right, to go to Africa and make an internal market. You see, get your own capital accumulation, okay? Expand that capital accumulation. In some region of Africa, wherever you're politically acceptable, wherever you're politically accepted, get some political power with that and further expand that capital accumulation, okay? I'll give you an example, actually. There's this dude I've heard about who's in this country, maybe the Gambia, I don't know. He's a foreigner, like a foreign, like Latino type character. He has a business, I think, like canning mangoes or something. Like canning mango juice or something. Who knows, right? Or canning mangoes. It's a thriving business. He could convert that to political power. He's hiring 8,000 something people. It's a good percent of the nation's industrial goods. He could get political power from that. But he's a foreigner. Of course, if you're not native to some parts of Africa, you will be a foreigner, no matter what, right? Even if you're in Africa and you go to another nation in Africa, you'll be a foreigner, technically, right? So, regardless, though, if you can get, like, this person can obviously probably get political power, you could get political power. You get political power, and you get that, you're canning some goods in one corporation, hiring 8,000 people. What if you're canning goods and you hire, and you get more land and you hire, like, 400,000 people, right? Now, your capital accumulation will come from other parts of Africa that want your goods. You see what I'm saying? Instead of looking at Africa as one unit, look at your political activity as one unit, right? And you're not going to be exploiting per se. You're not going to be exploiting because you're giving out these canned goods as people would want, and you're paying your workers fairly and all that. It's not exploitation. The thing that you are doing, however, is you're accumulating wealth, and you're accumulating wealth for your political region, and then you can then use that for political power, get alliances, get expansions, get so on and so forth, get political power in other nations. Political power in other nations means that you too can now have a union, have a political federation, all that stuff. Like, we can do this. We can liberate the continent. It really just requires us to get active, to do the work. But it's the liberation of Africa is coming. Okay, the liberation of Africa is coming. Believe it. All right. We cannot realistically immediately abandon production. All right, these brothers like the book. We cannot realistically immediately abandon production of cash crops as a source of foreign exchange earning. We must have a long-term plan to minimize our dependence on such crops. the production of which takes so much of our labor time without commensurate income, and at the same time neglecting to produce what we need for our own development. We should utilize our weakness in the world market to strengthen our economic base by importing new technology and capital goods as needed for that objective. After setting in motion the process of real national development, we will then be able to fully enter the world market on our own terms and from a position of relative strength like any other developed country. D. We must learn to be frugal, to be collectively nations of savers and not of wastemakers that we are. This requires exceptional discipline because we cannot afford to be anything less at the start of our long journey to national prosperity. E. As we are so heavily indebted thanks to the sins of previous governments, there are two ways of resolving or minimizing the pains of the problem. We either renounce the debts on the odious debt principle, which is perfectly legitimate ground on international law because 1. The people were not consulted with the debts when were contracted. 2. The governments that contracted the debts were mostly illegal, either because they were military regimes who came to power through coups or one-party dictatorships which did not enjoy the mandate of the people. And 3. As we do not have anything to show for it on the ground, it is obvious that most of these loans were corruptly contracted, and therefore the people are not obliged to honor them. The bankers must suffer the consequences of their wrong decisions, as in any business that runs at a loss, or they and their corrupt leaders must settle accounts between themselves, either via the Swiss bank or through courts. The second way out is, if we accept the debt burden, then Africa can collectively start to negotiate with our creditors for a 20-year moratorium on debt servicing and an immediate freeze on interest, both of which are a major source of capital outflow. Smart banks would naturally accept this second option. Smart bankers would naturally accept this second option. The meager foreign exchange that we are currently earning from our exports must be spent most frugally by carefully choosing between imposing either absolutely essential consumer goods, i.e. social consumptions such as health services, education and transport, or on goods to advance our technology, and on producer goods, especially machine tools industries, that is, machines that build the machines. G. Gradually we would be... Wait, did he go from I... Oh, no, okay. G. Gradually we would be able to change the composition of our exports and imports to conform to our reorientation strategy. Stepped up export of manufactured or processed goods will increase our foreign exchange earnings and enable us to import advanced technology and equipment. That is to say, by gradually minimizing the production of cash crops for export and instead diverting our efforts toward the development of food, housing, textile, and garment industries to begin with, in order to expand the home market and raise people's income, we will be creating favorable conditions for utilizing our socially necessary labor time more efficiently and productively for people's needs, as well as for exports based on higher valued goods. The foundation of our economy, as that of any developed economies, must be home-based. H. As 90% of our populations are engaged in agriculture, therefore, initially, the modernization of agriculture must be our top priority, and the raising of rural incomes, the motive forces of our economies. By improving rural skills through production, raising of rural incomes, the motive force of our economies. By improving rural skills through production and construction, irrigation works, water conservation, fish farming, food control, soil improvements through intensive use of natural manure, afforestation, proper training in the maintenance of ecological balance, etc., and the introduction of technical know-how. So actually, let's read that again. As 90% of our population are engaged in agriculture, therefore, initially, the modernization of agriculture must be our top priority, and raising of rural incomes the motive force of our economies. By improving rural skills through production and construction, irrigation works, water conservation, fish farming, food control, soil, proper training and maintenance, modernization of agriculture will help promote rural industrialization and promote economic complementarities between the urban and rural sectors of the economy. That should solve one of the most important contradictions in undeveloped economies, namely the urban-rural dichotomy. It will also help stem the rush to cities by rural youth, as the Chinese slogan aptly puts it in the campaign to keep the youth in rural areas, leaving the farmland but not the village, entering the factory but not the city. So this is really important. I wanna actually highlight this. You know, you as a statesperson, as a political entity, could use the state's resources, the state's budget, to modernize, industrialize, even if slowly, the agricultural sector. You know, first for your own, your own people's survival. But of course, remember, you want to overproduce. You want to overproduce in order to get into trade and exchanges, and thereby get the wealth. Okay. If you're just like subsistence farming, if you're just doing subsistence farming where the people are surviving on the land with nothing to show for it outside of survival, there's no wealth to be made. You know, that's one of the things that happened in like earlier Africa, the idea that you're not overproducing. So in Kemet, however, you would have overproduced. You know, you were bound to overproduce. You were socially obligated to overproduce. You understand? And the sense of, taxation was exactly that. You give 10%. No, not 10%. You produce a certain amount based off of how much land you have. You know, so you do your subsistence farming, of course, but you also have to produce a certain amount for the state. The state collects that, and the state then uses that to negotiate with other states. You see what I'm saying? So that would be an African model, or the original model of an economy. The idea is that you overproduce and exchange that with those who may want what you overproduced. And so in the case of food, if Africa is truly starving, you going to Africa, getting that farmland, getting that agricultural base, and then overdeveloping food, and then not just giving the food away, but selling the food, and when you sell that food, you make a surplus. You get the wealth automatically. Whatever you're exchanging the food for, you now have a supply base. You now have something, and that's really. And then you use that something to get other things. You use that to get more machinery. You use that to get so that's the logic of the wealth development. That's the logic of the economy that we want to build in Africa. But mainly it's like, yes, if Africa needs food, and then you already have a built-in economic channel, and it's just a matter of time. It's just a question of why aren't you active in that? That's really the only question. So, our industrial development therefore must initially be geared towards serving agriculture, and agriculture in turn must serve industry. The strategy will help to set in motion the process to self-sustaining independent national economies, gradually put a stop to capital outflows, accelerate the process of accumulation and of the development of productive forces, thereby ushering in the realm of expanded reproduction. J. Identification of areas where savings can be effected. To start with, there must be a drastic reduction of spending on the military. So I would not advise that. You don't want to, you want a military. Now, of course, you might want to have a drastic reduction if you're I go back to the idea of, you have a food surplus, you give the food surplus out, you get wealth. What do you do with the wealth? Do you turn it back into more agricultural development? Do you turn it back to more machinery in agriculture, or do you turn some of that to the military? So you want to actually turn some of that to the military, because the truth is this, that no matter what, you're not, you're still under a real human threat. Okay, you're still under a real human threat regardless of what sort of good ideas you may have for your own internal economy. And that's just the reality of it. So, military. Official foreign travels, now widely abused and a big drain on our foreign exchange, must be reduced. Overseas embassies must be cut down to an absolute minimum, must be reduced to 4 or 5 essential areas of significance for promoting real national interests. For example, UN, Washington for the IMF and the World Bank, London, Commonwealth, or Paris for the Francophone countries, Brussels, EU, and at the OAU. Embassies are notorious for squandering foreign exchange resources, both legally and illegally. So that's actually pretty interesting. So you see that even though we're trying to cut away from the white world, he's saying that all the embassies should be in the white world. That's pretty interesting. I think that's actually, I'm gonna put that. So this would be page 18. All the embassies in the white world. I'm gonna raise this because a nice sister told me to read this book, so I'm gonna ask her about this stuff. Alright, so K, we must learn to utilize every potential internal resource first before resorting to imports. Right? This is most essential in the early stages of capital formation. For example, use of natural manure instead of imported chemical fertilizers. For example, one cow produces 1 ton of manure annually. We can tame and train some of the wildlife for production work. Wildlife is also potentially a great source of energy, which in many cases can be used to replace imported oil-driven machines. In Burma, the entire timber industry is based on elephants. In Zanzibar, the entire clove and coconut transport was based on animal-driven carts, which brought much prosperity to the nation. And oil milling, was based on camel energy, and so on. We can resort to modern machinery only when we have a sound and prosperous basis at home. Japan utilizes ancient and modern technologies side by side, and as a result has achieved what is now called the Japanese miracle. Why is this, like, what do we mean by, so, like, here's the thing with manure. There are some regions in Africa where they have, like, cow-based economies, right? You can get their manure. You understand? Like that's the thing I was saying about trade. You might have surplus food. You send them food. They send you manure. You might be like, oh my gosh, why do I have manure? No, but the manure then is natural organic manure, and it what's his face? Like you could send your own specialist to collect the manure. You know what I mean? Like if the manure is just sitting around in like fields that do nothing, you can collect some of the manure, send it back home, and then you have that. And you might be like, why would I want to deal with feces or whatever, right? But the reality is that what the feces, like, it's either that or you buy chemical manure. You know what I mean? Whereas if you buy from these, the people who have the cows or whatever, right? What you then have is that you're having this African economy that now has its own its own socio-dynamic, and you could also even purchase the cows. You could also buy the cows with the food. So like you have this barter system that then increases the wealth of your people. So it's a really interesting relationship, I want to say. So L, we must strive to establish a more efficient public transport system which will make large-scale importation of private cars unnecessary. The foreign exchange thus saved can be diverted to importing productive inputs in the form of new technologies and machines essential for increasing production of consumer goods needed by the people, for creating more employment and raising people's standard of living. There are several other areas for saving our limited foreign exchange resource which can be investigated. For instance, Cuba, after being abandoned by the Soviet Union and embargoed by the U.S., has embarked on an ingenious method of saving her meager foreign exchange earnings in order to continue the production cycle. There is a lot that can be learned from the Cuban experience, both as a warning and as an economic necessity. So yeah, the other example would be bikes. You can, and the thing is that you can produce bikes at home. You don't need a lot of technology to produce a bike. Like you don't, like, not in the same way as a car. And of course you could have a native car industry, but the bike industry is also like just as good. Above all, like as opposed to like public transportation, you can just have bikes. And I mean like pedal bikes. Although there are nations that have public transportation that is motorcycles. But again, like those you have to buy. So you have to buy, and they're relying on oil. But of course, if you manufacture like solar powered, blah blah blah. Above all, special attention must be paid to developing a scientific economic management capability, which is essential for rapid economic transformation. So far, our experience with these leadership in Africa is that it tends to be excessively civilian leadership pool, where the Idi Amins have not taken over state power, range from university graduates of one kind or another to semi-illiterate mob rousers, depending on the needs of the top man in authority at a given time. These may be to increase his popularity, step up his security or secret police, to isolate certain sections he thinks dangerous, to step up political thuggery and intimidate the population, and so on. The national economy is normally given lowest priority. An economist, or for that matter, a trusted sycophant, without the faintest idea of economic management or the intended direction of the economy, may be appointed as Minister of Finance or Economic Affairs, or agriculture or industry being distinguished as such. Otherwise, the economist will make a mess at managing the economy, and the trained manager will make a mess at forecasting economic trends, right? So you have to have. So he's going to tell you what kind of people you should have in terms of economy. Economic management entails formulating policies. For example, responsibility for decision making, how many kinds of ownership, state ownership, private ownership, cooperative ownership, planned or market economy, or a combination of both. In which case, which is to be primary, what are the intrinsic relations within the economy, how to coordinate production with marketing, how and where to invest the accrual surplus funds, for what national, regional, or district objective, what are the principles guiding the national economy and how best to attain them within a specific time frame, how to balance the two major departments of social production, that is, means of production and means of consumption, what and how to set priorities and for what specific or general purpose, whether all these are to be left to market forces to determine or to national plan or a judicious combination of the two, etc. All these need special orientation, which a university graduate or mob rouser may not share or be aware of. Scientific management of the economy needs training in the orientation in all these aspects before launching the economic transformation exercise. Okay, so number 9, 3 basic strategies to development. Within the two main social systems mentioned above, i.e. the neoclassical and the social democratic, there are 3 methods usually adopted as a strategy to development. A, the ideological, either capitalist, socialist, or mixed. B, economism, i.e. responding only to the economic imperative for better or worse. And C, serving the people, the economics of the new democracy. The latter is a scientifically based common sense approach to development that gives priority to the long and short-term needs of the people and then organizes the economy accordingly for their attainment. Experience has shown that approach A has many dangers, the ideological method, because going exclusively by the dictates of one's ideology, unchecked by the scientific method of verification, very often tends to lose sight of the concrete realities of a given situation. Ideology must remain only as a guide to action, but should never be turned into a dogma. Serious mistakes have been made by both capitalist and socialist fundamentalists who have refused to alter their course even when red danger signals indicated disaster ahead. The shortcomings have become obvious by the catastrophic results of the ideology of monetarism in the Anglo-Saxon countries in the 1980s, and by the rigid Soviet model which distorted the very essence of socialism and socialist planning. And of course, even though these socialists were trying to go rigid socialism, in the end, it's alleged that they're not socialists at all. So it's really critical to not be dogmatic in either of these Eurasian philosophies, Eurasian ideologies, particularly because you're an African. But that's just one part of it. The reality is that, you can't expect some socialist, or anybody from the 1860s, 1850s, to have the ideology, right? To have the ideology or the ideological wherewithal or the intellectual capacity, even, to organize a modern economy. Economy of 2020. You can't possibly expect that. So the idea of being dogmatic to them, like even listening to them is kind of preposterous, but even being dogmatic to them is in itself just a wrong-headed approach. And I think that's something that I hope I articulated well for you to understand. But approach B too has many shortcomings. For one thing, economics on its own has no foresight. It can forecast figures, but it cannot predict their social outcome. It can probably work for good economic results, but they are not always in conformity with the social or people's needs and their welfare. It is rather like the proverbial doctor who performs a technically successful surgical operation, although the patient dies. That is why it is said that the national economy is too important to be left to the economists. Approach C is more pertinent because it is guided constantly in what society or the people want. That is why we call it a common sense approach. Of course, if you are dealing with developing a national economy, you must have economists, but only as technicians and not as initiators of policies. The common sense approach uses economics to justify or to subject to critical analysis what has been ordained by the authority of the people to give indicative figures of what might happen to the growth of the economy in the abstract if action A or B were to be taken, but not to decide whether to take option A or B. That is a political decision. The key factor contributing to the current African crisis that ever since independence, African countries have been have been run on the principles of the B approach, where you had a 5-year plan. It was the economists, mostly foreign, and not the political representatives of the people who laid down national objectives. This has been the root cause which has led Africa to blind alleys and the virtual economic ruin. The crisis is made worse by once again following the dictates of the same foreign economists in the hope of bailing us out. In every case, these economists tend to be steeped in capitalist ideologies which have no relevance to our condition, and they always get it wrong. On the other hand, their radical opponents, mostly with socialist orientation, often tend to challenge them on the same grounds but from a different direction. The result is a dialogue of the death whose message does not reach the people because they cannot follow what the fuss is all about. And this is actually something, like, again, I said that ANC, EFF, and VLF, and it's exactly this. I'm going to take a screenshot of this, by the way. So it's exactly this, this idea that this idea that, I don't like this political party, I don't like the ANC. They're just a bunch of capitalists, blah, blah, blah. What we need to do is we need to enact socialism. And socialism, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, look at your economy, produce food. Just produce food where you can and get the resources where you can. Get the resources to expand your food industry, your agricultural industry, however you can. That's it. It's not complicated. It really isn't complicated. But we're making it complicated. Again, Africa needs political leadership, and I want to say your political leadership. Africa needs your political leadership. Where national economies were not planned, no specific economic objectives were set. It was only hoped economic prosperity would be achieved by encouraging full play of individual greed operating in the marketplace. Countries like Kenya or the Ivory Coast operated on this basis, and they were hailed as success stories. But actually only a handful, again, mostly foreigners, benefited at the expense of the majority of the impoverished masses. There has indeed been a lot of economic activity, impressive office towers, blocks, and so on, which gave the impression of growth, but in real terms the people at large have become worse off. In both these success models, there are currently intense political and economic upheavals. That is why we should stick to the common sense approach as the guiding principle of the economics of new democracy. Whereas the traditional development theories have treated the question of poverty and deprivation as an outcome of some immoral international arrangement, and that to alleviate the situation is by means of changing the world economic system and stepped up exports, the common sense approach treats the situation more seriously. The causes of our poverty are not external but internal. Let me just read this again. This is why we should stick to the common sense approach as the guiding principle of the economics of new democracy. Whereas the traditional development theories have treated the question of poverty and deprivation as an outcome of some immoral international arrangement, and that to alleviate that situation is by means of changing the world economic system and stepped up exports. And see, this is what I'm saying. This is what I'm saying. We believe, this is what we do. Well, the IMF has been punishing us, and blah blah blah, and the World Bank is beating us, blah blah blah. He's saying no. The common sense approach is to treat the situation more seriously. You can't change this global system. Just get out of it. Just get out of it. Like I said earlier, withdraw from it. The causes of our poverty are not external, but internal. Although the external causes help to aggravate the already rotten situation, and to correct it, we must seek internal solutions, and then and only then external factors may be resorted to in order to stimulate the corrective or transformation process. And I want to ask you this, because I know people are already thinking it. Well, how is it not external if they're killing our leaders? That's why you have widespread political education. That's why you have, that's why you have these books, you have these so on and so forth. You give this economic, you give the people this idea, this information, so that even if they do kill one person, another person has the same brain. You see what I'm saying? If you kill one person and another person has the same brain, or like if 10,000 people have the same brain, it doesn't matter if you kill one person. You understand? Come on. But at the same time, the common sense approach must thoroughly understand the situation in the external world, the world economy, because only in understanding who controls it, its history, its mechanism, its motive force, and our position and role in it, can we best use it to our advantage and not allow ourselves to be used by it. So let's get the international. The internationalist perspective, number 10. The internationalist perspective, the slide to the status quo. As part of the world economy, Africa cannot help but play her part in it and seek answers and solutions to her problems by taking into account what is affecting the continent in the context of the political economy of the world. But there is an important distinction between trying to understand the world political economy and seeking out role in it and being subservient and only reacting to it as if we were reacting helplessly to the forces of nature. In the latter category, we should put the new African elites, the decision makers who are inordinately influenced by the multilateral agencies, like the old elites before them who were brainwashed by the colonialists. They don't seem to be able to take the initiative on any major issues affecting their countries. They simply sing the tune of prevailing refrain orchestrated by the imperialist powers. They are propagating the notion of the global management of an interdependent world, which really means managing the status quo for the benefit of the imperial powers at the expense of the poor countries. You see what I'm saying? That's the socialism, to be honest. That is not the way of looking for solutions to our problems within the context of the world economy. This is a futile pretext of seeking solution to the status quo from within the status quo. It is an attempt at seeking adjustments within the same old economic world order without attempting to change our own role in it, beginning with changing our own economies as a precondition to a new order. It is a negative way of seeking to establish the new international economic order while we remain in the same economic status of commodity producers. Such kind of globalism is meaningless. It is only a way of intoxicating the poor with hope. No, it's no globalism. Just get out the globe. The real world economy, in fact, is not interdependent. It is an exploitative arrangement whereby one section of the world benefits from the weakness and backwardness of the other, and it is in the interest of the former to maintain the situation as it is. Africa has no power to change it, shout as we may. We can only change what is in our power to change, and that is our own economies first, their structures and direction. We made a fatal mistake right as independence. We had a choice then between sliding with the emerging world socialist movement and mercifully get cut off from the capitalist world economy, or remain junior partners in an economy dominated by the U.S. and the ex-colonial powers from whom we had just emerged from colonialism. In Asia only, China, North Korea, Laos, and Vietnam chose to join the world socialist movement, which sought to bring about a completely new world order, a socialist world. In Africa, none went that way, although we invented various forms of socialism to fool the masses while we were pulling them more firmly under the grip of Western domination. So now my man's taking, or now this brother's taking shots at Nyerere. So I mean, I'm gonna have to look into that. But I realized that I could probably put up like 4 screenshots, so I'm gonna try to take another screenshot here. But yeah, he's taking some shots at Nyerere or something, or Puma. I don't see why. You don't got to, but it is what it is. In a comparatively short time, China and North Korea became medium industrial powers, largely self-sustaining, while the rest of us became more and more maldeveloped, with millions of new social problems emerging by the day. But in the case of China, and I want to say this though, at least for China, I'm not familiar with North Korea, but in China, they had a leader. They had a good leader. You have to realize that you have to be a good leader. You need good leaders. You need good leaders. You need good leaders. Mao was a good leader for China. That's the big difference. Okay, that's the big difference. We could say, oh, it's the economy, it's the blah, blah, blah. No, Mao was a good leader for China. Stalin was a good leader for Soviet Union. And you might be like, well, look, Mao and Stalin, they was killing their citizens. Yes, they were. But that's not what I'm talking about. You know what I mean? That's not what I'm talking about. Like that right there is the Western propaganda. You know, you are getting murdered every day by these white boys. Okay, you're technically their citizens. You don't say, oh well, uh, you don't say, oh, Donald Trump's killing his citizens. You don't say that. You know what I mean? Even when he's calling in, extra. You don't say that. So like, come on. All right. So in a comparatively short time, yeah. But in the case of China, with extraordinary foresight, by mid 1956, wait, hold on a second. Yeah, by 1956, she abandoned the Soviet planning model, which had the fatal weakness of emphasizing the development of heavy industry at the expense of light industry and agriculture. Instead, China decided to put in practice the Maoist strategy, known as the 10 major relationships. Among these relationships, the key one was the between heavy industry on the other one hand and light industry and agriculture on the other. Rejecting the Soviet and East European model, the Maoist thesis pointed out that their lopsided stress on heavy industry, the neglect of agriculture and light industry, results in a shortage of goods on the market and in a stable currency. 35 years later, this observation proved to be remarkably correct. It's like he just copied and pasted this from earlier. With the tragic collapse uh, of the Soviet system in Europe, while China continued to make great strides in her economic development, performance, and modernization. In spite of the inherent weakness in the Soviet model, however, the West could see in it the potential for becoming a serious challenge to the West's strategy of world domination or hegemony. The West, therefore, decided to fight it to the finish with all its enormous advantage over the young emerging socialist system. When Africa began to gain its independence, this war against socialism would at its peak. Africa consciously or unconsciously decided to side with the West against socialism, at the same time declaring ourselves to be non-aligned between East and West. So I want to say this though, like it's unfair to say that, like a lot of the African countries did side with the socialist countries. Like Angola and like I said, Niger and Nkrumah. Like a lot of them did side with the socialist countries. So it's kind of whatever. It was never explained how anyone could honestly be non-aligned between a just and an unjust system. In any case, we decided on our own free will to place our countries under the sphere of influence of the West as junior partners and in effect signed our own death warrant. We were to be condemned never to see any serious development of the continent collectively or individually. As long as we remain in this demonstrably unjust world economic system from a position of weakness with circumstances so heavily weighed against us, there was no way we could attain any form of development beneficial to ourselves. What therefore are the causes, both external and internal, of the African crisis? So here's the external causes of the African crisis. The modern world economic arrangement was created soon after the anti-fascist war in 1945. It was designed to continue the war by other means, this time against the socialist order, which was then emerging as a system that could provide an alternative to the status quo, especially to the poor countries. Thus, the first conference to re-establish the old system in a new guise was held at Bretton Woods, USA, and the system became known as the Bretton Woods system. Its declared objective was to stabilize international monetary and financial regimes which were disrupted in the pre-war period of the 1930s, and also to help the Western world's economic recovery and combat socialism in the post-war era. The main institutions created for the job were the World Bank, IMF, and GATT, the General Agreement of Tariff and Trade, all of which at the same time designed, in addition to recovery, to strengthen Western grip of the world economy. We became members of all these institutions soon after independence. 30 years or now, we have already been demoted from the status of independent and honorable members of these institutions to that of their obedient servants. It will be useful for those who urge us to deepen our involvement in the economic arrangement in the spirit of interdependence to remember that at no time has the system ever worked in our interest, and there is no evidence to show that it might do so in the future. The alleged interdependence can only be of the kind in which we are permanently dependent on the West's scheme of things, to feed us, house us, and even clothe us, while we can be depended upon to continue to facilitate the West's massive exploitation of our human and material resources. The system itself, by the way, has a long history starting from the dark epoch of the slave trade to colonialism and imperialism, and in all those phases Africa has remained its constant victim. An interdependent world indeed, but we need not go too far in the past. Our immediate purpose is to have a full grasp of the current international economic order in order to find the way out of our problems. And to grasp the nitty-gritty of this modern world economy, it is of primary importance to first of all understand the role of international finance as a major force that lubricates it. Very briefly, there has been three significant eras of international finance. The first was between 1870 and 1940, which was dominated by Britain. The second was between 1920 and 1939, which was the center of international finance, which was when the center of international finance shifted from London to New York. So that's what I was talking about of how America went from a creditor, or went from a debtor nation to a creditor nation after World War One, right? That collapsed in 1930 with the Great Depression, followed by the Second World War. The third era, the era of U.S. hegemony, the Bretton Woods era, was between 1947 and 1985, when the U.S. itself was reduced from a creditor to debtor country, as Japan replaced it as the world's foremost creditor nation. Okay, so now Japan is a big creditor nation. Interesting. And then the U.S. is now a debtor nation. So that's actually pretty interesting. I like that. So I wanna take a third screenshot. You can only have 4 screenshots on social media, and I wanna have all 4. I was neglecting them earlier, so I'm just gonna start doing them now. But yeah, this is actually a pretty interesting concept. I actually don't follow the credit debt thing. I mean, I know America has this huge debt, but I didn't really follow it. I feel like Japan has a debt though now. I can't remember though. Alright, so the decline of the U.S. hegemony, which inevitably cost Africa a lot owing to her dependence on the dollar. For example, for every 1% rise in interest rates, the debtor countries have to pay $4 to $5 billion in interest. It was brought about by excessive U.S. policies, the overprinting of the paper dollar, more than $600 billion. Oh yeah, okay, so the decline of the U.S. hegemony, which inevitably cost Africa a lot owing to her dependence on the dollar, was brought about by the excessive U.S. policies, the overprinting of the paper dollar. So that's actually pretty interesting too. I wanna stress how that's interesting, because when we talk about reparations, we talk about, oh, I'll just print the money, and the reality is that if Africa is reliant on this printed money, then that can have an impact on Africa. So that's a pretty interesting notion. I actually wanna ask that question. So 36. This is 36. Oh, 23. What was this? U.S. hegemony and Africa's reliance on the U.S. dollar, and what role that has in reparations. Now, of course, reparations is a remarkable idea. It's like a non sequitur, if you will. But it's worthy dialogue. It's like a something to think about. Was brought about by the excessive U.S. policies, the overprinting of the paper dollar, mismanagement of the international monetary and financial systems, adventurous wars of aggression, Korea, Vietnam, the advent of Reaganomics and its monetarist orthodoxies, and so on. In other words, the U.S. used the system to its own advantage and became the root cause of the global economic problems in the 1980s, the debtor problems being the most significant one for Africa. The debt burden made debtor countries even weaker than they were before. Correspondingly, creditor countries under the IMF leadership gained strength through the This is a typo, see? I'll tell you, everybody has typos. IMF insistence on conditionality and reliance on the old imperial policy of divide and rule over debtor countries, which as a result could not form a united front of debtor countries from which position to negotiate. Although the debt crisis, like the crisis in the monetary and financial system, was brought about by the actions of creditor countries themselves, the responsibility is placed on the debtor countries. The developed countries dumped loans and capital into the third world, seeking large returns in investment. Unequal trade terms cut into third world export income, weakening their ability to service their debt, and as the Anglo-Saxon countries got into their most serious recession since the Great Depression, they raised interest rates at the same time, forcing debtor countries to repay their debt on time. And of course, the rise in interest rates has compounded the African crisis. Furthermore, the failure of the misdirected struggle launched by the Third World for the so-called New International Economic Order, which had sought to bring the multilateral financial agencies, the IMF, and World Bank under the jurisdiction of the UN General Assembly has helped to absolve creditor countries from any responsibility for the debt crisis. The failure has actually strengthened the position of the IMF vis-a-vis third world countries. From then on, it has continued to impose its own conditionality on African countries with impunity, resulting in massive unemployment, a steady decline in the living standards of the people, and spreading domestic political instability with all its devastating consequences. Ironically, one of the original purposes for which the IMF was created, in addition to facilitating world trade, was to promote employment and general well-being. Under the existing conditions of this independent world, there is no way that Africa can repay the debt estimated conservatively at $300 billion in the mid-1990s, while the net outflow of wealth from Africa to the West continues to mount, leaving nothing for domestic capital formation and investment. Conservative estimates put the outflow at nearly $200 million per day, $200 million per day, and mounting. The declared principles of the multilateral agencies and their role in the new country as they were emerging from colonialism and joining the institutions were defined as providing aid to assist developing countries to reach a point where they could participate fully in an open, market-oriented international economy, and that aid policies were to be subordinated to the norms of the market system. But even in those early days, it was clear that as far as the emerging countries were concerned, this objective contradicted the principle of national sovereignty because it frustrated the right to development of these young countries by forcing them into a world market system which was itself not open, not free, and extremely imperfect, favoring only the strong against the weak. And this reminds me of something that Nyerere said about the relative comparison between two different economies. And I reprinted it. You could look up, search Nyerere's talks. Some of them are in English, and those are the ones you'll probably understand if you understand me. Unless you understand the Swahili ones, which are probably much better. But I don't know them. But you listen to him, and he's talking about how you can't put yourself in this global economy. You can't put yourself in the global economy. But as this person also, as Babu points out, they did. He went into debt with the foreign countries. He went into debt in the world economy. And so, what do you do? How do you do it? And of course, you might say, well, look, just pull away from the world economy. That's what nationalization is. And you already know that that's what they attack. They attack countries for nationalizing resources, nationalizing this, nationalizing that. That is essentially pulling away from the world economy. And that's why they have these coups. That's why they have these assassinations. That's why they kill these political leaders. Because they want your access to the resources. So it's a tough game, but you have to do it. And a part of it would be, like that mass education. So don't underestimate the importance of education. Do not underestimate the importance of education. And it kind of speaks towards this idea of how should we educate our people. Is it just historical knowledge, or is it a political consciousness that involves a political demand? A political demand of leadership. So to this point, I would say it means that there's still more to write. There's still more for me to write. So comparative advantage in free trade. Let me see. Comparative advantage in free trade. For this pact, the dominant nations always insist on the principle that all is fair in trade and in war. But this is acceptable only as long as you are in a dominant position. Their interpretation of fairness was elevated long ago to a principle known as the comparative advantage principle. Its history, as we know, goes far back to the philosophy of the British philosopher David Hume, and later expounded in the economic theories of Adam Smith and David Ricardo in post-industrial revolution Britain, when she dominated world trade. To this day, this law has remained the basis of liberal free trade technology. Our elites, who are now blindly advocating the notion of an interdependent world, base their rationale on the theories based on this law, ignoring the fact that it was conceived and applied by Britain at a time when it had all the advantages over other nations, right? So So Britain said, yeah, let's do free trade, but they said that because they were the most powerful. But even then, weaker nations had a different approach and were very critical of the comparative advantage thesis. They saw it in a serious threat to their own national security, domestic welfare, and industrial development. This must be even more so today for countries whose economies and foreign trade are largely based on primary commodities. Can there really be any comparative advantage between the peasant producer of, say, coffee or tea and the industrial producer of the tractor from whom the former has to buy his inputs, or other absolute advantages to the industrial producer? As a matter of fact, our present experience proves to us again and again that the industrial producer countries find this system of free trade so advantageous to them that they are prepared to use what amounts of force via the IMF and World Bank, or even in the bilateral form, as the case of U.S. and Cuba, against any poor country that tries to embark on an independent route to development on which they dare to resist their dictation or challenge their hegemony. Right? So we're coming to the close, okay? Historically, even the mighty Germans of the last century found it necessary to protect their economy, their dignity and sovereignty against what they dubbed the imperialism of free trade. This was at a time when Germany was already becoming an industrial power in its own right, but still realized that it would not be to its disadvantage to abide by the thesis of comparative advantage in free trade when it has still weak compared to Britain, which then had a decade or so head start over Germany. Similarly, I think you might have made another typo there. Similarly, for the poor and weak countries of Africa today, like the then poor and weak countries of the last century, the primary preoccupation must be not a blind adherence to the international trade norms or a belief in the law of comparative advantage, which is really the law of the strong over the weak. It must be to produce for their own needs, to strengthen their state systems so that they do not become vulnerable to the dictates of other interests, to struggle for the attainment of unity of the state and nation in a continent so mangled and fragmented by slavery and colonialism, to reorient their economies so as to achieve unity between industry and agriculture, a precondition for integrating their economies internally, and to evolve independent national economies in place of the present colonies. You may call this economic nationalism, but all countries that started late on the road to development, Germany, USA, Japan, Soviet Union, China, etc., had to resort to the development strategy, and history has proven them right. Why should Africa be an exception? Okay? So, let's go. 13, internal causes of the African crisis. So there's external crisis, now we're going to go to the internal crisis. Internal crisis. In the wake of the economic crisis and the debt problems which have put Africa in its most serious socio-political plight, various alternative strategies are being offered from different perspectives. As noted above, there are three main approaches to development, and the ideological, the economic, and the common sense approach. So far, the alternatives have been outlined for Africa and are either of the first or second type, but none from the point of view of the common sense approach. There is a Lagos plan of action designed to be operative from 1980 to the end of the century. Its objectives are the achievement of a regional food self-sufficiency, the provision of shelter, health, care, housing, sustained growth and development, and national and collective self-reliance. So this is really important to remember too, that as much as you may say, hey, I got a good idea, it's probably already being implemented in Africa. A lot of times, your good ideas are being implemented in Africa. It's really just about going to Africa, or wherever, really, about going somewhere and implementing it. You know, like I said, there was a nice conference yesterday. People have, like, their own independent institutions. People have their own control over the police. People have so on and so forth. You know, you just have to go and do it. You just have to go and do whatever it is that you want to do, and understand that some of our people already did that. So then there is an African priority program for economic, hold on a second, regional self-sufficiency, provision of shelter, health care, housing, sustained growth and development, and national and collective self-reliance. Then there's the African Priority Program for Economic Recovery during 1989 to 90, adopted by the United Nations. This was followed by the African Alternative Framework to Structural Adjustment Program by the UN Economic Commission for Africa. All these ambitious programs were motivated by honorable intentions, no doubt, but so far none of them has produced any hopeful signals. On the contrary, as we are more than half through Lagos Plan of Action, indications are the Africa is worse off now than it was in 1980 when the program was launched. We have already gone beyond the target of the UN Priority Program for Economic Recovery, and we have seen no recovery at all anywhere. An African alternative framework sounds more like a theoretical debate between ECA and the World Bank rather than a serious strategy for Africa's alternative policy. That is why it has failed to be anywhere near achieving its stated objectives. The reason why all of these so-called alternative programs have failed is because they all start from the same premise, namely that Africa has no alternative except to go from an export-led development strategy. That is to say, Africa must rely on the export of her primary commodities to earn foreign exchange to enable her to import her domestic needs. That is why, on the basis of this rationale, we see Africa's cities and towns jammed with all types of foreign cars, and we can't even produce spare parts locally to service them. The concrete reality is that this strategy is inapplicable to Africa's current level of development based on the present production structure. Its acceptance as the linchpin of policy, or policy, goes counter to basic laws of development, which, as we saw, asserts the internal causes are the basis of change, while external causes remain only a condition of change and not the other way around. Any country that tries to alter this reality is doomed to failure. Thus, the internal causes of the crisis aggravated by the debt burden may be summarized as follows. In addition to the topsy-turvy structure of our economies, which gravitated outwards rather than inwards, a new phenomenon entered the world economy. The oil crisis of 1973, the transfer of massive surplus of unwanted dollars to the oil-producing countries and then recycling them back to Western banks, created a crisis of surplus, unusable funds. Unusable because no developed country wanted to take responsibility for the overprinted $600 billion US dollars, as foreign banks were thus eager to dump their petrodollars and other surplus funds in the mid-1970s. African countries recklessly borrowed and fell into a debt trap. They failed to draw up comprehensive repayment timetables, taking into account the total amount of the debt incurred, the investments absorbed, and interest due for payment, their foreign exchange reserves, and development of the productive forces, the growth rate and targets of their national economies. The resultant imbalance between the debt incurred and income forced them to incur new debts to pay for the old ones. So this one's actually really good because it tells you this, that African incompetence, Africa's incompetence and African incompetence saved the American economy, from its own incompetence. You see, like, the American government would have collapsed based off of its own stupidity if not for our people having an even dumber economy. Just having even dumber, it's as Garvey said, intelligence rules the world, and ignorance carries the burden. U.S. economy was saved by African incompetence. Africa, you have to wake up, and I say Africa has to wake up, but when I say Africa has to wake up, that means that you as African people have to wake up, and wake up. Wake up is just not it's not even a joke anymore. It's not a joke. It's not. It means something. It means, look, you could have had, America would have destroyed itself, and then you saved it. You saved it. Secondly, inappropriate use of foreign loans resulted in poor economic performance and low foreign exchange earning. Loans went into financing consumption, building brand new capital cities, ultra-modern airports, etc., while hardly any went into development of the productive forces. Let's go. 14. The real alternative strategy for development. So, economic nationalism. Africa won its independence on the strength of its political nationalism. Unlike European nationalism, which has come to be known as jingoism, African nationalism is anti-imperialist, anti-predatory, and anti-jingoism. It is nationalism of resistance, and therefore progressive in essence. But we must not limit it only to political aspirations. It must extend to the economic sphere. While we remain internationalist in our look, we must base our internationalism firmly on our nationalism. This time, it is the nationalism of survival. What then is the scientifically based common sense approach? The primary purpose is to change the economic structure from its present colonial orientation. The new structure must seek, as mentioned above, to steadily increase the production of goods needed by the people. To achieve this objective, the national policy must establish sound relations between its different branches, within each branch, and between all the links in production. Then the manpower, material, and financial resources of society must be utilized rationally. And lastly, the improvement of the people's livelihood must be directly linked with the development of production and construction in such a way that they promote each other. This structure will ensure a continuous growth of national income. Right? The strategy for this objective in principle, with each country devising its own detailed strategy taking into account specific national conditions, can then be summarized as follows. First, discard any illusion about export-led development for economies with extremely backwards agriculture and no industry to speak of. We must, as a cardinal principle, look internally for our progress. Second, recognize that neither the Western model of relying on the invisible hand of the market nor the Soviet model of lopsided development of heavy industry and indiscriminate nationalization is any good for us. What we need to make use of is both the invisible hand of the market and the visible hand of central planning and long-term program. Third, I see this is, again, I feel like a contradiction of, how could you be in the unjust and just and then also say, oh, well, we're going to use both economies anyway, right? Like, that's exactly what Africa was doing. Third, move as quickly as possible as a matter of top priority from the primitive mode of production inherited from colonialism and enter the realm of expanded reproduction. It is the most decisive threshold on the way to an independent national economy. Fourth, develop a production base in agriculture and industry, initially for the purpose of providing food, clothing, and shelter, the basic human needs, and in the course of producing these basics, the rest will follow. Employment, expansion of domestic markets, increased output, and surplus funds for investment, social welfare, etc. This will arouse mass enthusiasm for production and social harmony. Fifth, raise standards of living of the people by improving the quality of life. Sixth, understand fully the laws of economic development and seriously study our own national conditions. On the basis of this knowledge, devise a sound policy in addition to agriculture and industry on energy, environment, communication, and transport. Promote small and medium enterprises to serve the growing home market with emphasis on labor-intensive industries to provide employment opportunities, promotion of skilled labor, and the expansion of the cash economy. Raise educational and modern technological standards and culture. Constantly improve medical care, develop a sound policy on foreign investment in order to make effective use of foreign capital without losing national economic independence. Finally, develop a sound foreign trade policy in order to put foreign earnings to full and productive use. All these objectives must be guided by a policy of prudence and frugality in both the public and private sectors. Seventh, on the debt question, short of declaring odious debt, as outlined above, urgently negotiate for a 20-year moratorium on debt servicing and interest freeze to allow the national economy to pick up reconstruction momentum. To be effective, this can best be done on a continental or at least regional basis in collaboration with other African countries. Eighth, all this requires a dedicated leadership, honest and incorruptible. It can be done. So that's the end. All this requires a dedicated leadership be done. So here is the definitions of terms and concepts used throughout the text. In this discussion, we have come across several technical terms and concepts which the reader may not be familiar. Therefore, it will be necessary to define some of these most important terms and concepts because they are key to understanding how to plan a national economy efficiently and effectively. Did not know this was through the text, but let's go. 15.1, primitive accumulation of capital. This refers to the earliest stages of capital accumulation out of surplus value wealth created by the whole of society and be appropriated by one part of the society for its own use. In a slave society, the surplus money that came out of the slave labor was appropriated by the slave owner for his own use, either as investment capital or in trade. For a society to be vibrant, it must produce surplus value so that it can productively invest in further development. The point is, who is to appropriate the surplus for investment? A few individuals for their own use, or the whole society so that it can be productively invested for the economic and social benefit of all. So again, like I said, if you're just getting a one nation, you would get the surplus value from pretty much the other nations in Africa. And then you use that to provide for the other nations in Africa. You see what I'm saying? So that solves the question. If you go from a nationalist perspective, instead of this, I'm going to get all of Africa, you're not going to get all of Africa. Not overnight. So you have to act accordingly and act intelligently. The best you can hope for is political leadership in a nation or in a region, in a city, and you'll use that to your advantage. You use that to catapult and create wealth. And like Africa could be united. It's not. Africa can be united. Africa can be liberated. It's not rocket science, but we have to get it done. Of course, you might be like, well, Oni, why don't you just get out there and do it? There's a big pandemic going on right now. All right, it's not like it's like you can't do anything. 15.2, reproduction. There are three kinds of reproduction: simple reproduction, expanded reproduction, and contracted reproduction. A. Simple reproduction refers to a situation when a given society produces its social wealth and it consumes all of it, including the surplus value, so that it is left with only its means of production with which to start the next production cycle. In other words, it's a static society. So this is actually important. This is what I said about subsistence farming, right? Uh, Expanded reproduction refers to a situation when society conserves or saves some of its surplus in order to invest it so as to start the next production cycle from a higher level and expand the social wealth. In other words, this is a dynamic society. A more dynamic society saves and invests more of its surplus to start the next production cycle at a much higher level. In contemporary experience, since the advent of Ronald Reagan as president of the U.S. and the introduction of his policies of monetarism, the distinction between more dynamic and less dynamic societies are clear. They are signified by the difference between the successful German and Japanese economies, which conserved and invested a large portion of their surplus value, and the Anglo-Saxon economies, which consumed most of their surplus value. This they did through money exchange, currency speculation, and stock exchange gambling instead of investing in the production of goods and the creation of new wealth. Making profit out of currency speculation or stock exchange may enrich a few individuals, but it does not create new social wealth. Only manufacturing and agriculture create new wealth. So that's important too when you talk about bourgeoisie, finance capital versus industrial capital. That the industrialists having the manufacturing and influencing the agriculture, they do have the wealth, whereas other things may not. So like speculation. Well, speculation can get you rich, obviously. Contracted reproduction refers to a situation where a society goes through several production cycles without allowing social wealth to maintain itself and instead allows it to shrink and become less and less. Then, as the days of easy money in the mid-1970s and 1980s, society goes out to borrow money from the international money markets, not to enhance its production cycle, but on the contrary, in order just to keep it going on the previous level. This is the situation in which most African countries find themselves today. We are not even static, but worse, our economies are declining. So, I think it's the last page. Socially, and then there's 15.3, socially necessary labor. So a functioning society is based on the economy of labor time. If a significant proportion of the social labor time of the total time available to a society is not allocated to the maintenance and improvement of the means of production, then the society will reach a point where it will not be able to produce on the same scale as before. For instance, if the society wastes a large portion of its social labor time, mostly the production of agricultural commodities, for export and gets less and less in return, as in the case in many African countries, then that society is headed for serious economic and social problems, which may well lead to a crisis. This is the state in which many African countries find themselves. We are paying the penalty of wasting our socially necessary labor time in the production of commodities which we can only sell, but which we cannot ourselves use if there is no demand for them, or if we are offered at acceptable prices which will not enable us to buy goods needed by the society in compensation for the social labor time so wasted. We cannot eat coffee or tea if no one wants to buy them. In other words, we produce what we do not consume and consume what we do not produce. The penalty for this kind of topsy-turvy national economy is, in most some extreme cases, to expose the people to famine and starvation on a mass scale. And I want to just say, on top of that, warfare. So that is the book. That's the book. Thank you all for listening. That's the book. I see. I had some more likes. People took away that one like or 2 likes. I don't know. But it is what it is. Appreciate everybody for sticking around. If there's any questions, let me know ASAP. But outside of that, yeah, I did enjoy this. I feel like there's a lot of merit to it. I didn't like the democracy talk in the beginning, obviously, but he actually left that, abandoned that. Again, it goes back to the last book, the handbook on revolutionary warfare, that you want to engage in political parties and political education. So one of the things that we have to start stressing among our people is political education, or economic, or even like this right here, economic management, economy management, and so on and so forth. These are not even subject matters for our people. A lot of it is, police brutality. We have to focus on Africa being self-sufficient and self-reliant. And yeah, exactly. You can't eat cocoa. Africa being self-reliant and self-sufficient, and how that's going to go about. And how that's going to go about is with pioneers like you or me. Like, we should have investment cooperatives. We should be demanding investment cooperative where we. I mean, like again, like one of the sisters I already know is in this movement where they buy land in Africa, and they do that agriculture thing already. So, and they buy land, they employ the local Africans, and they you know they employ them, they make their surplus, they make their foods, and so on and so forth, foods for exports, or to eat or whatever, sustain themselves. But the point being, though, is that this is what I should be continually doing. We should be doing this more on a wider scale, on an active scale, and that's what that's where we have to start heading as a people. Because if we're not doing that, we're screwed as a people. So I appreciated this book. I like this book. I'm going to, of course, end the podcast, but appreciate everybody for coming through and listening, and have a wonderful day. Uh, and stay blessed, Bashem Yem Hotep, Uncle Johnson Neb Neb, and Amen Ma'at Dua Nature.